And it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Let me just switch my screen so you can see my, okay. I am a curator with the History Center. And in fact, we were talking beforehand, I did a program at the Northland Library last year, the week before everything shut down. So I have to say, I can't believe that a year later, here we are, and we're still in that situation. It boggles my mind, but I'm happy to be here, even if it is virtually this evening. And this talk is, I figure out how to get this going here. Oh, there it goes. This is focused on the history of World War II, and in fact, the Steel City in World War II. And that might clue you into the fact that I'm going to be talking a little bit about what Pittsburgh was doing during the war. As a curator at the History Center, I was part of the team that worked on our World War II exhibit a few years ago, back in 2015, and I have continued to function as the staff member who really still deals with our World War II stories. We, this week and over last weekend, have been working with some things related to the stories of Rosie the Riveter, because it was National Rosie the Riveter Day this past Sunday, March 21st. And so I am happy to continue working on this subject, and there's just more stories than will fill up all year in terms of project development. But I am going to start this presentation tonight with this image. And in one sense, you all have a benefit over the people who might see this. When I do this talk in person, this image is a little bit harder to see. But I like to start and ask people if they can figure out what's going on in this photo. You can see a group of people. They're on the right-hand side. They're looking over the hill. And it's easier for you to see than it is for people who are sitting back and it's projected on a screen. But this is a group of people who are waiting on Grandview Avenue to watch the first blackout test in Pittsburgh on April 18th, 1941. So these people are all lining the side of the hill and they're waiting for the lights to go out. Now, this was actually a serious blackout test. It wasn't truly 100% a blackout. The mills did not have to shut down. There were a couple of other details. Some bridge lights stayed on. The Morse code that flashed out Pittsburgh on the top of one of the buildings actually did not turn off because of the need for airlines to use that as a point for them to locate things on the horizon. So it wasn't a 100% test, but it was actually something run by the military. They had mock flyovers and it was a serious test. Why in April of 1941? Now, you know, people today, the sense of World War II is that everybody pitched in and everything kind of was this big collective effort. Sometimes we forget that prior to Pearl Harbor, not everybody felt quite the same way. And one of the interesting things about this test is that not everybody in the area participated, even though it was supposed to be a test for the entire, what they called the Pittsburgh Industrial District, which included most of the Mon Valley towns where some of the major mills were. And the mayor of McKeesport thought the whole thing was ridiculous, said, no one's ever going to invade us. There are never going to be Japanese or German planes flying over Pittsburgh. No, I'm not going to do it. McKeesport didn't participate. There were also either a person or a group of people throughout parts of Pittsburgh who left notes like this on cars that said, Friday's blackout is out. It scares babies and it doesn't convince anyone. Signed, a peaceful citizen. These reminders that prior to Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of different feeling back and forth about, should we be in this war? Can we find a different kind of settlement? But it was something, as I mentioned, that was run by the Army, and you might be interested to know that even though there was some debate in the local area, Pittsburgh was actually one of 5 locations that same evening in April that went through this. There was a location in Seattle. There was a blackout in the Boston area. There was a test in New York. And then there was one more. That's El Paso, Texas. And if you're thinking, well, Okay, I get Seattle and New York and Boston, and of course, Pittsburgh. What on earth is El Paso doing on this list? El Paso is the home of Fort Bliss, and that's where the coastal artillery units were stationed at that time in 1941. And in effect, they were the groups who were running this test because it was seen as part of the coastal defense system. And so the questions arise. What is Pittsburgh doing that is so important? And that tapped into something that we debated when we were doing the exhibit. When did this region really start fighting World War II? If you talk about the story of Pittsburgh, the city, when did people begin to feel the effects of what was going on overseas? And the reality is that it really started in 1940. And some of you, of course, might also be familiar with some of this. But Pittsburgh's mills and factories, after the Great Depression through the 1930s, by 1938, 39, they're beginning to see some pickup again. And here's one example by 1940 of battleship armor that was produced at the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company. And here is another, and these are images from a collection that's actually housed at the University of Pittsburgh's special collections. It's a collection of material from the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company, a gentleman who was an executive with the company. So you can see here too, turrets, grading plates. This all is material related to US Navy work around 1940. And in fact, Pittsburgh is one of many places that are impacted, especially by the Battle of Paris and the fall of France. You know, I would say that prior to the May of 1940, there's what some scholars call the fake war, the phony war, the political war. Now, while certainly citizens of Polish descent in Pittsburgh who watched as the Nazis invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, is the official start of World War II because of that invasion. They didn't see it as a phony war, but there was this sense, well, maybe we can find a diplomatic solution, maybe there are other things we can do. And then when the Nazis invade France and France falls, Paris falls, that's when the situation changes. And it's shortly after the Nazis invade France that you have President Roosevelt on May 16th of 1940 issue his well-known radio address and goal to make 50,000 airplanes a year at a time when the year before the US military had less than 3,000. What this means is that the places who are making the raw material to do that are going to ramp up very quickly. And indeed, that is what happens in Pittsburgh. And so by the early fall of 1940, some of these things that we now think of as huge accomplishments in Pittsburgh for World War II were already underway. For example, the single largest ordnance contract, that's a military contract issued in Pittsburgh for all of World War II, was given to the Mesta Machine Company in West Homestead in September of 1940. And they were doing more than 300 of a certain type of mortar gun. Now, the image you see here is not the gun that was part of that contract. This is actually a different weapon. It was an experimental piece. Mesta, in case you're not as familiar with them, was the company that made equipment for the steel mills. So they made the sort of material that made it possible to make sheet steel and huge pieces of equipment for others. And this image just is a great example that demonstrates the scale of what they did. They loved to have these photos with a press 4 stories tall and the men standing down below it. This was a gun that was originally created potentially for coastal defense. It was later, they experimentally cut it back. They created a version of what you see here that was probably just a little bit longer than the crease line in that image. And they were supposed to be something that they might have used for the invasion of Japan, which never happened. So in fact, what you see here is an experimental piece that was never really used that much, but it gives you a sense of the scale of what Mesta is doing during the war. For those of you in the Northland and even farther north, our neighbors up in Butler, that famous moment, the American Bantam Company, they deliver their prototype. What becomes the Jeep out of Butler is something that happens on September 24th, not 21st, 1940. And this particular edition of it's not technically called the Jeep, we call it Gramps. It's the earliest one of the models that is still in existence, and it's now on loan to us from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, is on display at the History Center. But again, some of these hallmarks are coming up as early as 1940. This will move into 1941. And in fact, that date for that blackout test, April 18th, 1941, we find a very close parallel here. Note the date on this news clipping, April 25th, 1941, a clipping announcing the groundbreaking of a huge propeller factory in Beaver County. This is going to be a new Curtiss Wright propeller factory. There had been an older factory on Neville Island, but it was sort of outdated. And so they made plans to construct this entirely new facility. Of course, by the time this newspaper article is out, the military, the Army, certainly knows about this. I think one of the reasons why Pittsburgh was included in that blackout test is because things like this were going on. It was a plant that would make items like this Helldiver propeller. This is a piece that was made by the Curtiss Wright plant in Beaver. This was on display in our exhibit, and in fact, we still have it in the building now. We're hoping to put it back out on display. It's currently on loan also from the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. But the propeller factory is going to come back to my story at the end, because it's really important, not just as a Curtiss Wright facility. It's the largest propeller factory of its kind in the nation at the time. So again, in the Pittsburgh area, you have this huge factory, and they're not just making propellers for Curtiss Wright. As would happen with any military contract, they're working for everybody. And so you can see this is an ad. Go back here a minute. Here's the ad. This is the detail at the bottom of this ad from Curtiss Wright's propeller division. You can see just a few of the companies that they're making propellers for. It's almost everybody. Lockheed, Douglas, Boeing, North American, Grumman, all of the big names in aerospace engineering at the time are on the list. This will make Curtiss Wright a target. So remember that, because we'll be revisiting that. So when you talk about the Steel City in World War II, you know, it's funny. Obviously, Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania are huge in terms of their output of steel. Now, the funny thing is that sometimes you see in the local coverage at that time that leads to a little bit of frustration here, because when you watch, say, the movie tone reels and the news footage from the time period, the kind of things that would have been featured in local theaters, it was often Boeing's headquarters in Seattle or activities in Detroit, those dramatic images of tanks rolling off of the line and the automakers that got a lot of the headlines. Pittsburgh didn't make so much of the finished product, but they were crucial to the raw material that helped everybody else produce those things. I put just a couple of statistics here. US Steel and its subsidiaries literally smashed more than 1,000 production records during the course of World War II. And Western Pennsylvania steel mills put more than 95 million tons of steel into the war effort. Ultimately, Pennsylvania, and this includes places like Bethlehem Pete Steel in the middle of Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania alone as a state produced more steel than all the Axis powers combined. And just think about that for a moment. So people here in Pittsburgh, and these plants are running every shift 24/7. There are pros and cons to what that does to the local environment, but they are clearly aware of the crucial nature of what they're doing as part of the larger economy and part of the larger defense effort. Now, it's not true that Pittsburgh created nothing that was a finished product. You see this newsletter cover here is one of the US Steel newsletters. We have a run of them in our collection, and this one shows you the cover of what was called an LST, or landing ship tank. I'm sure some of you have heard of them before. We had there's one large LST that is still active on the Ohio River, LST 325, and it stopped here in Pittsburgh a few years ago. The one on the cover here is LST 282. You can, if you look closely, you can just make it out in that picture. That's a real ship that was made at the American Bridge Company in Ambridge, and it actually served in the Battle of Normandy. It was one of a number of LSTs from this area that were part of the Normandy force and continued to serve until it was sunk by a German glider bomb in August of 1944. So that image actually shows you a real LST that was produced in this area. But the interesting thing is that Pittsburgh was actually more than just the steel city. And I think this is also why you would have seen Pittsburgh included in the list that I showed you at the beginning on that strategic map. You have companies like PPG or Pittsburgh Plate Glass that also work with coatings. And during World War II, they're doing a lot of experimental work, trying to figure out, for example, how do you create, in effect, bulletproof windshields? And this is work that they actually started during Prohibition. The experiments with bulletproof glass were really accelerated in the United States during Prohibition, when police forces began looking for ways to create a more defensive vehicle against bootleggers. But by World War II, PPG is trying to figure out how you create versions of bulletproof glass that would work for airplanes, and not just for windshields. Could you, for example, create shatterproof tubing that if it was hit with flak or it was hit with some kind of ammunition, it would still break, but it wouldn't shatter into a million pieces and shred the inside of a plane? Could you create a self-healing gas tank? And that was a gas tank with a rubber coating inside where if a bullet pierced it, it would close up again. These were not things that would make a plane invincible, but what they were trying to do was create a set of secondary defense systems that would allow a pilot to get a stricken aircraft to a point of safety. You were trying to buy people time to get that aircraft out of the air without it crashing. And so PPG is working on that, and they're not the only one who are doing this sort of experimental work. Now, I am not an engineer, I am not a metallurgist, but I'm going to show you a couple really odd looking but interesting slides here for material that's also from that Carnegie, Illinois steel collection at Pitt. This image here of the diagram material on the graph, and you see over here on the right an odd photo that has metal and bullet holes, and you can see some writing on here. It says machine gun blast a couple times. I'm going to show you another. Here's another one. These are images of tests that are being run on experimental metal composites that are being created in tandem with Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company. And they weren't doing this alone. Part of this was, again, it's a government-funded contract for these companies to explore different ways of creating aircraft armor. Can you vary the recipe of the steel plate, of the way different layers are combined or affixed together? Can you do something that will maximize that kind of fine balance between as bulletproof as possible, but the plane still flies? What can we get out of this? And Carnegie, Illinois Steel is working. In fact, they're working with competitors across the country. I'll go back to this one for a minute. I like the one that has the writing on here, and they're taking these to testing grounds. Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They also took some of them to a couple testing grounds up around the Great Lakes, like the Lake Erie testing ground or proving ground. And they're doing this through 1941, through early 1941. Here is one more sheet related to that project. And again, I am not an engineer, and I am not showing you this so that you can understand all of the details of what's seen on there. But here's the piece that's really interesting. Look down at the date on this confidential sheet in this aircraft project that they're working on. The day after Pearl Harbor, they're just continuing to work through these projects. So again, when we're looking back to that blackout test in April of 1941, this is a project that was probably well underway by that point. And so again, some of these early examples are Pittsburgh, very, very early as part of World War II, clearly participating in that. Now, there were downsides to that. And there are multiple ways that Pittsburgh's story intersected with national stories in ways that we might not think of at first. And this is one of them. The image you see here of this Japanese American family, that is not, the large image is not from Pittsburgh. That's a family who were sent to an internment camp on the West Coast. And you might think, well, but that happened in places like Wyoming and California. It didn't happen here. And it's true in the details of that. But all of that work with the aircraft armor, that very same collection, part of the Carnegie, Illinois steel collection, also includes material that show that even after the laws about Japanese American internment practices started to loosen up, and in 1943, the federal government actually allowed some students to go ahead and go back and start attending college. Do you see the smaller image here? And the young man who I just highlighted in the blue, his name was Kenji Okuda. This is neighboring Ohio, Oberlin. It was Oberlin College at that time. He went to Oberlin from an internment camp. He had been going to the University of Washington, ended up in an internment camp, and then went to school at Oberlin and ended up being student council president. But across the border in Western Pennsylvania, authorities related to Carnegie, Illinois Steel and the entire consortium of groups that were working on that aircraft armor project petitioned the federal government to ban Japanese American students from the Pittsburgh Industrial District because they saw it as still this, it was strategically too vulnerable of an area to allow them in. And the request was approved. So even though these students were legally able as American citizens to go other places, they were kept out of the Western Pennsylvania district. And I will say that is not something that I knew at all or had ever heard anything about until I started doing work within that collection. And it was documented through letters back and forth between some of the people who were involved in the experiments. Now, of course, on the other hand, there are many workers who are extremely welcomed in the region. And by 1942, as I note here, even desperately wanted. You know, we've been doing a number of programs at the History Center this week related to the stories of Rosie the Riveter. And we just had a school program with students and teachers yesterday. And Rosie and all the real women who served as Rosies, you know, the employment of women in the local plants really started ramping up by 1942 and into 1943. Here is one example. This woman, we know her name. It was Julie Bodnar. She was doing work inspecting shells at the Christie Parks Works in McKeesport, one of a fantastic collection of US steel images that are part of the Smithsonian's collection here. And then here's another one. This is an image from US Steel's subsidiary, the Oil Well Supply Company. And this happens to be up in Oil City, but I love this image because here's this woman in the center of it, and she is surrounded by these shells. I think just this wonderful visual reminder of how all of these companies, all of US Steel's subsidiaries, completely turned around their product lines to be doing this. And here she is standing in the middle of it. I wish we knew her name. I don't have a name for her. Some of the US Steel photos, they're identified and some they're not. But women's hiring begins to pick up by the summer of 1942 and will proceed into 1943. And I have two great cartoons. Even by the time things are appearing as cartoons in the local newspapers, you know that enough of it is going on so that people are aware of it, and they're going to look at this and understand what it's alluding to. So if you look at this great cartoon on the left, here's a group of women, the unsung heroes of the war. They're marching off. Some of them clearly have joined the auxiliary units of the military. A couple of them are heading to the factory, and they're walking past the very clearly marked lingerie shop. People at the time would have found that a little bit funny, but they also would have known that what that's really alluding to is this idea that these women are going off to do what at the time would have been considered very non-traditional activities, serving in the military, going to the factory. They're bypassing that lingerie shop because they're going to do their part for the war effort. And then they'll be back to the shop after the war is won and their husbands and other loved ones return, and they can go back to kind of that normal other life. So this is a funny cartoon. People at the time would have understood the joke, but at the same time, it wasn't just a joke. As a political cartoon, there were very serious issues underlying that. Now shift to the cartoon on your right. This one, unless you know the context, it might be a little bit less clear that it's connected to defense work during the war. We have these two women who are standing there. They clearly are supposed to be perhaps upper middle class or upper class women. One of them has her lovely fur coat on. The woman says, "Oh, look, that's Lillian's first welding job. Isn't it lovely?" And it looks like this abstract little piece of art. Well, that is referring to what happens in late 1942 and into 1943, when places like Drevaux Shipyard and American Bridge open up their welding programs to women. As far as I have seen, and I haven't seen when American Bridge opened theirs up yet, but everything that I've seen, apparently Drevaux started opening welding classes to women in very, very late 1942. And what you have here are two photos from our Drevaux collection. The one on the left is a group of women welders. There were, in fact, records at American Bridge, for example, of entire crews working on ships who were women. They would take a class. Drevaux sent most of the students, at least the ones I've seen, to a class at South Vocational High School on the south side of Pittsburgh. So they took the class and then they would begin working at Drevaux. We don't have names for the women on the left, but on the right, the woman who you can clearly see there with the mask up over her head, her name was Mrs. Bessie McCarroll, and she also was a welder at Drevaux. And we know who she was because this photo appeared in the Sun-Telegraph newspaper. And actually it appeared on June 2nd, 1944, in a big spread where a newspaper reporter from the Sun-Telegraph went around to a selection of women, and they called them mainly all war brides. They were women who they had identified their husbands had gone overseas. In the case of Mrs. Bessie McCarroll, who you see here, her husband had been sent overseas. She hadn't heard from him, but they knew he was headed to Europe, undoubtedly to be part of the D-Day invasion. And that's why the reporter was there. He was going around asking these women how they were going to feel when they heard the news of the European invasion. I think the thing that especially younger audiences tend to forget now is that everybody at the time knew, by June 1944, everybody knew the invasion was coming. D-Day, the word D-Day was already in the local vocabulary. There were a ton of articles out about when do we think it's going to happen? Is it going to be Memorial Day? Is it going to be after that? So everybody knew that it was on the horizon. I can't imagine the reaction if a reporter went and did that today, went around to everybody, hey, how are you going to feel when we hear about the news of the invasion? Our dynamics are just so different with how that operates. But here, the person, and actually it was a woman reporter, she went around to people like Mrs. Bessie McCarroll and said, so when you hear of the invasion, are you going to go home? Are you going to just collapse in hysteria? And Mrs. McCarroll here said, heck no, I'm not going home. I'm staying right at my job. We'll keep going because the harder we work, the sooner our husbands come home. And that really does epitomize the attitude of many of these women who were taking these jobs and doing this. And, you know, as we were talking with the students yesterday, I think we forget just what kind of a challenge this was. Learning a completely new skill set, learning to work and function in an environment you never, in some cases, could have imagined being in before. Some of these women might have commuted as much. There were examples of people commuting as much as 2 hours, multiple buses, to get to a job at Drevaux. So a huge number of sacrifices were also made. Now, given that I always try and make sure that there are stories from the local neighborhoods when I'm talking, here's another Northland story. It's not quite where the library is, but these three young women on the left were also welders at Drvo. They're the Jurjevic sisters, Anne, Julie, and Vera, or V. Vera, of these three, she's the one on the right, she was the oldest. She got a job at Drvo first, and she started working there, and then essentially her two sisters decided, hey, we're going to follow. So they took the welding class together, and they all were working at Drvo. They eventually all worked on the same yard at the same time. Three more young women, and the family had settled. They were Serbian American. The parents had immigrated from Serbia, and they had settled in North Perry, in that area. So here's three more examples of young women who were working as welders at Drvo during that time. And in fact, as we were talking with students yesterday, when you talk about Rosie the Riveter, it's a bit tricky for Pittsburgh because there wasn't a lot of riveting going on in Pittsburgh. But for the process that Drvo and American Bridge used to create the LSTs, in fact, some of what previously would have been done with rivets, by this point, with this kind of streamlined method they created, some of it was actually being done with welding. So technically speaking, people like Anne, Julie, and V here were truly the Rosie the Riveters of Pittsburgh. It's a great photo. It's part of a small family collection. And just as a reminder, the work that places like Drvo and American Bridge were doing in connection with LSTs, they were a huge part of the service overseas, and in fact, just a huge part of the Normandy invasion. Out of the, and I sat down one time when we were doing an anniversary program and counted, of the 103 LSTs who were specifically listed with the major force, 53 of them were made in Western Pennsylvania. This particular LST, number one, this was made at Drvo, and it actually served at both at Anzio before, and Salerno before it served at Normandy. So these young women are learning skills that are then truly being put to use in these vehicles that are going to help win the war. Another not very obvious Pittsburgh activity, as I said, Pittsburgh is the steel city, but it's more than steel. The H.J. Heinz Company worked, especially some of the women workers, to make glider wings. This might seem a really odd situation at first, but the Waco CG4 glider became another piece of the force that was used. And one of the places where they were used the most was actually also in the Normandy D-Day invasions. And by the time the contracts were out to create this glider, by the time the entire glider program really got off the ground, any true aeronautics company that could make airplanes was already contracted with more work than they could do. The Waco gliders were being done largely by an Ohio company, was the creator of the model. And so they subcontracted out to anybody who they thought had some kind of skill that might contribute to doing this. So furniture companies, for example, were contracted. In the case of H.J. Heinz, pickles might not be a complete link, but certainly the barrels that the pickles would have been in were. And so you had a certain amount of woodworking experience. These young women were, again, trained in how to do this. But here's another example of tapping into the expertise of a local company in a not so obvious way to create a part of what was crucial for, especially in this case, the Normandy invasion. And this is just so that you can see, these are illustrations of a Waco glider. They were really quite controversial. They were one of the most dangerous parts of the service. They were pulled on another plane, and then that tow line was cut and they glided in. They could carry equipment in the belly of that plane. It could carry like a Jeep, an entire corps of men, but they were very difficult to steer. They actually were not used in very many battles, but they were used in Normandy and in a couple others. And so again, in a not very obvious context, these pickle makers from the Steel City are making glider wings that will participate in a campaign that will help to win the war. Now, competition for these workers was really intense. I think it was May 1943, the US Steel estimated that alone in 1 month, as men were continuing to be drafted and going into the service, US Steel alone in May 1943 estimated that they lost 32,000 workers to the military. And so you really had a call from all over looking for people. And this is just one example of an ad for a Maryland shell loading plant that is advertising in the Pittsburgh newspapers. Plants in West Virginia and Ohio advertised here, and likewise Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh industrial region plants certainly also advertised in Ohio and Maryland and West Virginia to find workers. Places like Crawford County, Meadville sent buses down to recruit people to take them back up to the Geneva area to work in ordnance plant up there. So there's a lot of competition back and forth. And especially for women, this all at times becomes a real challenge. And so you have two competing narratives for women, not just in Pittsburgh, but nationally, who are working during World War II. And some of that is illustrated by this fun cartoon on the left. And you can see the title of it is actually what it's supposed to be saying. It's, and in my spare time, as these two women talk to each other, and the one welder here is filled, she has her arms filled with other children. The thing to realize is that this is a cartoon that was created by the federal government. This is a piece that was created by the Office of War Information. When the WWII is creating a cartoon showing one of their women welders with all of her children surrounding her, you know that there's an issue that they're trying to address. And in fact, it really became a challenge at certain points, recruiting women to work in some of the factories during World War II. And you'll see this in the Pittsburgh newspapers. We need 5,000 more people from the local area, because they looked around and they said, you know, we understand that you need that, but all of my husband's gone, all of my male relatives are gone. I'm keeping up the house. I'm taking care of the children. I've never dealt with the car before. I'm doing all of the financial work. I'm doing all the bills. Rationing is making it so much harder to get food and to figure out how to put meals on the table. Women really at times did push back against that, and especially the question of childcare. So one of the other things that has tended to be forgotten in the narratives about the war, and when we see that we can do it, the Rosie the Riveter woman, is that there were also things that were actually put into place to help support her. And in Pittsburgh and in other places, there were even federally created daycares for places like Dervaux so that the women welders could go ahead and focus on their work. And that idea of single versus married women is something that scholars are still kind of in some ways trying to balance out. And if you just looked at kind of the newspaper coverage in Pittsburgh, you might think that almost all of the women who were working in the area during that time, who went into the factories, were single women, because they're the people who tended to be profiled in some of the coverage, not always. Sadly, what happened in the newspapers is sometimes a married woman will be profiled for a story when she had become a widow, because it's the newspaper coverage and they're really looking to create a story that people are going to read. It's going to be a human interest story. So when we were talking with students yesterday, I was saying, you know, newspapers are a wonderful source of material on World War II, but you have to balance them with other kind of material or you're going to miss a piece of the story. And in fact, during World War II, there was a huge number of married women who went back and took jobs in factories and actually kept them in some cases after the war. They didn't stay in the same job. They weren't doing the welding, for example, but they did stay in many cases employed. Now, of course, by 1942-43, everybody is catching on to some of these developments that now no one can miss. And Pittsburgh's department stores are acknowledging this too. And this is a great example of one of Kaufmann's windows. And Kaufmann's, they tend to come up the most. We have a collection of Horn's material too, but we don't have as much from the 1940s. We have a marvelous collection of Kaufmann's windows from the 1940s. And Kaufman's, their one big window that was on the corner of Smithfield and Fifth Avenue, they consistently devoted to war themes. This is one of them where they paid tribute to women war workers. This is a really great image because there's actually another Pittsburgh story in this image. We've been talking about the women workers, but there's another story in here too. And actually, again, it's a story that ties to part of the Northland. And that's the poster. Some of you may be familiar with this, but this is a poster, Men Working Together. It was an example of propaganda poster created very early in the war. And the gentleman in the middle of that poster, his name was George Woolslayer, and he was a Western Pennsylvanian. In fact, he worked at Allegheny Ludlam Steel. And what happened is that a government photographer had come around, he was taking a lot of portrait photos. Nobody knew what they were going to use this for, and they used 3 separate images. So again, here's the poster. Here's them assembling them. They put them together in a poster. Well, Mr. Woolslayer saw the final poster, had no idea before that that's how his image was going to be used, and he wrote a letter to the Office of War Information and said essentially, "This is great. I want to know, who are these 2 other men who are pictured there with me?" And so it started this chain reaction where first they found out who each other were, and eventually, and here's Mr. Woolslayer in the center here, the Office of War Information, sensing a great PR opportunity, invited them all together, and they brought them all to Allegheny Ludlam, and they stayed. They visited George Woolslayer's home in Brackenridge. And so there's this great series of images where they're touring the plant. Here you can see in the smaller image on the right, all 3 are posing by a copy of the poster that's on display at Allegheny Ludlam. And then the larger image here, the one night they hosted a party at George Woolslayer's house in Brackenridge. And the coverage on that is great. It's like, well, the party started at 8 p.m. and it went on all through the night. And there's other images in the series because, of course, the Office of War Information sent a photographer with them. And so there's some other great images in the series where you see later there's a table filled with Duquesne Pilsner bottles and people who are still there. But it really demonstrates this conviviality at the time and this commitment of these 3 men are all serving together. We're going to welcome the other 2 into our community, into our homes, into this kind of collective of people. And eventually what happened is they also visited both the ship where the sailor was serving and then the military base, or in this case, a US Army member was serving. So this great Pittsburgh story connected with a poster, and just a marvelous example of how one neighborhood, one community in the region responded to something that was happenstance. Nobody knew that his image would have turned out to be used on that poster. That brings us back to the department stores. I'm going to go back to that image with the 2 women in the Kaufman's window. You know, the department stores were a consistent source of information during the war. You see here an ad for activities at Gimbel's. Both Kaufman's and Horn's were very involved with not just supplying things, like they always had offers of gift kits that you could send overseas, but also of information. They would sometimes convene different kinds of rallies. They routinely kept up windows with different developments related to other things going on in technology related to the war. This is also Kaufman's window, and it was the underside, the little cabin on an airship. Think sort of the Goodyear blimp kind of thing. And in fact, some of those were being made over in Ohio. And so here they're showing you, in effect, high tech for the time. So I look at that now and I think people might think, well, that's a very odd subject for a window, but I think audiences at that time would have, in a sequence of windows where this is changing all year, have understood the context of a piece like that as part of a series. Even Christmas was a part of that sort of tradition. And I wish we had photos in the collection for this one. We don't. The only images that I have found of it thus far are from the newspaper. This is part of a Kaufman's ad from the Christmas windows for 1941. In fact, note the date here again. This is December 8th, 1941. So clearly these windows were already planned. Again, if you look especially in the lower right corner, where from what I can see, I think that they're actually making plane bodies. The story was it was this wooden soldier who was called up and he's inducted into the service, and then you're going through these military scenes. And I think that one was showing you planes. But again, it's reminding us of just how much this sense of military activity was already going on. These had to have been installed prior to December 7th in Pearl Harbor. And these themes, for example, of military work continued on the holiday windows throughout the period during World War II. This was another year they did Kaufman's. All the windows dealt with Christmas traditions and the soldiers maintaining some kind of holiday tradition overseas. So you can see here this one, note there's a couple groups of people marching there. You see the Quonset huts, which are a classic World War II symbol. And so it's another good example of how, of course, the war was almost unavoidable at the time. And with so many people in Pittsburgh, a part of the defense industries, they really felt like they were contributing. Now, Kaufman's is interesting too, because the collection includes material like this. These are two more images that show you Kaufman's, as with that blackout test, was fully prepared to handle any sort of emergency that would arise during the course of the war. The image on the left is one of their firefighting teams. And I will mention them again later. They are there specifically in connection with air raid fire drills. And I'll explain that in a minute because I have a slide later that gives you a sense of what they're really doing. And then here is an image of men who are serving as part of the escalator squad. Those are staff members in Kaufman's in Pittsburgh who from every floor, if you had an air raid siren or a blackout drill, who was going to help people escape from every floor and get to the next floor, but frankly, behave in a normal manner. You needed some kind of crowd control. You needed people to help oversee that process. That was really the role of the escalator squad. And such images bring us back to that initial slide and my question. Here's all these people gathered to watch the potential blackout. How valid were those fears? How valid were these early efforts to get people to practice good behavior like this in the area? The blackout drills, this was just the first one. They had some problems during this one, quite honestly, because some people really did take it as sort of a party. There were examples of some who got in their car, packed sandwiches and beers and drove out on country roads to wait until the blackout moment and see what would happen and watch the planes coming overhead. But it quickly got very serious. By the time you got around to December 1941, blackout drills, and even the papers note this, that now everybody is taking them very seriously. You don't see any more jokes. You don't see people going out joyriding. How valid were those fears? And of course, as the mayor of McKeesport said, we all know that there was never a Japanese crew that flew planes overhead and bombed Pittsburgh. But there were some reasons for them to be cautious. Here is an example, March 18th, 1941, an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette with people outlining fears of sabotage. This was a wreck on the Pennsylvania Railroad where there was evidence that the tracks had been messed with, bolts had been pulled. It was clearly a feared case of sabotage. It wasn't the only one. And you're probably looking at this thinking, well, wait a minute, did we just switch to a different program altogether? One of the coolest sets of artifacts that came into us for the World War II exhibit included this. And I don't have it labeled because I want you to, just in your own space for a moment, guess what this is. It is part of a phone jack set that was used by this man. His name was John Leahy, and while he looks like a telephone repairman, actually he was working for the FBI. He was stationed in Pittsburgh, and he was stationed here because he was supposed to be investigating cases of potential industrial sabotage in Western PA. They actually had someone stationed here as part of the FBI to monitor this kind of situation. And what had happened, he had done something. His daughter donated this material to us, and he had done something and injured his back. So he had been rendered unable to enlist in the military, but he still wanted to serve. And so he ended up doing this. What he would do with this phone equipment, he used it to scale telephone poles, and it came with equipment that he used. I'm gonna go back for a minute. He used that phone jack to tap phone lines. While technically, after Prohibition, evidence gathered from phone taps was questionable, and it wasn't legal in every circumstance to use as testimony in court. But President Roosevelt, as part of his acts related to war security, had granted an executive order to J. Edgar Hoover allowing the use of wiretaps for issues of industrial security. If there was suspected sabotage, they were allowed to tap phone lines to find out what was going on. And so that's what Mr. Leahy here is doing. And you might think, well, how much of that really was going on in the area? And this is where, if I was doing this in person, I usually stop at this moment and I poll the audience. Has anyone ever heard of Operation Pastorius? If you were here in July of 1942, you might well have heard of this. Take a look at these men. These are two crews of German saboteurs in late June 1942. And look at the top row and the bottom row are two different crews. One set of men landed along the coast of New York, along Long Island. The other set landed down in Florida. What they were supposed to do was go off, meet together, and set off on this campaign of sabotage across the country. The group from Florida actually landed, quietly filtered into the crowd, and would never have been caught if it wasn't for the fact that the group in New York weren't so successful at their efforts. And the first gentleman you see on the upper left, George Dash there, he was actually caught. He got onto the beach and he, for some reason, he started walking and he ran into someone because there were people all over the coast of New York, people patrolling the beaches off of Long Island. He was caught. He went through this whole story he made up about, oh my gosh, you know, I was an American citizen and I'm volunteering to do this for your security because I knew that we would come back here, and I volunteered to be a part of this mission so I could help stop it. I don't think people totally believe that, but that's how they caught them. And he eventually turned in all of his other co-collaborators, and the plot was revealed. This clipping on the left that you see from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette shows all the trove of material that was collected. And while this was found someplace else, that paranoia, of course, bled over into this area. You can see this other clipping here, people saying, oh my gosh, we saw some of these people potentially in Washington, PA. In Altoona, on July 2nd, same time period, 225 people were rounded up as suspects by the FBI. And there's no accident that that's in Altoona, because one of the rumors that is floating around at this point is that these different saboteurs, there's a hit list. And I will say, I have later seen evidence that there really were lists. I've never seen a direct physical document that shows this, but I have seen evidence that FBI and other officials did believe there really were lists. And that's relevant here, one, because on that list was supposedly the horseshoe curve, hence the concern in Altoona. And one of the other things on that list, that Curtiss-Wright propeller plant in Beaver, the largest plant making propellers in the country. And the rumor was that it also was on a potential Nazi hit list. There was also fear that there was an Alcoa plant on the list, but it wasn't in Western Pennsylvania. It was a plant that was down south. So technically there were 3 companies from Western Pennsylvania that were on the list, but 2 sites potentially in this region. And that makes even more sense in terms of local fears about this. When you see a piece like this, this is also a set of documents that was in the Gone collection, which is that material that was related to Carnegie, Illinois steel. I showed you the aircraft armor material earlier, and then some of those early photos. This is a memo, and then a mimeographed sheet that was then, these colors were hand painted on there. It's a notice that was sent out to all the plant managers telling them to beware of a new incendiary device that was supposedly floating around the Midwest and eastern half of the country. This capsule that it would be there and it might explode. It's an incendiary bomb. If it's dropped, it will fall. And the whole purpose behind it is to ignite fires. When you saw that earlier image of the Kaufman's department store, the air raid fire crew, this is the kind of thing that they're actually training against. The sand in the bucket, the tools, it's for incendiary bombs. This is being sent to all the plant managers throughout the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Corporation. And if it's going there, I'm sure it was going to the others too. And so it's another reminder that while the mayor of McKeesport was right, there were never any bombing missions over Pittsburgh. People didn't know it at that time. Through 1943, they continued to run different kinds of drills and to do air raid tests. In fact, through 1944, some of the air raid tests were run. This is a great example of a mock battle that was run between enemy parachutists and then civilian defense units. They're actually all part of the Pennsylvania Reserve Defense Corps. It was an entire mock battle that they ran outside of Dervaux and McKeesport, Dervauxburg and McKeesport. Here is one of the photos that played in the newspaper, the 2 forces coming together. Now, it actually, the tests don't turn out to be as smooth as this suggests. March 1st, 1943 happened to be a really dry day, and actually they were using cartridges and blanks and they set the grass on fire. So eventually everybody had to drop their roles one way or the other and go and help put out the fire. But nonetheless, it's this really fascinating example of the preparedness, the stress on preparedness that continued in this area really through 1943 and into 1944. By the middle to end of 1944, it was clear to people after the Normandy invasion, after D-Day, although certainly the ferocity of the war was not diminished. I mean, even after VE Day, people had to continue to fight to make sure that momentum was not lost for the war in the Pacific. But after the first half of 1944, it was pretty clear that the fear that had prompted things such as those early air raid tests and blackout drills had gone. And so it's a good way to kind of return back to this picture and remind us once again of these people on April 1941, standing on that crest of that hill. You know, yes, they were eager to see what was going to happen when the lights went out, but there had to be a lot of anxiety there too. It had to be a crowd of people who knew what the city, who knew what their brothers and fathers and sons were facing. This is a time when the parents' generation had fought in World War I. People had lived through the Great Depression. So here they are kind of on the precipice of asking what comes next. Of course, we know eventually with Pittsburgh's help, with the help of the Steel City as part of it, the US was victorious in the war. But at this point, they didn't know that yet. And so that is just a quick arc of one story about the Steel City in World War II. As I said, there are so many other stories you can tell with that, but that's one sort of set of stories that start and end with that wonderful image on Grandview Avenue. And that's my main presentation. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and then I welcome any questions that you might have. And let's see.
Yeah, there are none in the chat.
Okay. I was going to say, the other night, I didn't see the chat. I can see it on this one. Good. Okay. Or comments. You know, the other thing, I will admit that in some ways I've never totally gotten used to doing these virtually, because usually what I do, if it's an in-person talk, I also just love to hear people's comments and reminiscences about the war. I know I've been in some groups where there were people who had family members who participated not just here, but other places. The list of spies. The list that the German spies were sent to destroy. There's a number of publications that talk about that. You can find a lot of that material just in general related to the coverage of Operation Pastorius. I can send some links. I should have put a couple links together to send to Caddy here at the Northland Public Library. I can do that. A lot of it is found either in connection with the story of Operation Pastorius, and then in stories connected with especially the Horseshoe Curve. And a lot of it is, some of it is in government documents that relate to the government kind of search for those saboteurs at the time.
Yeah, and I can always send that out in my
Okay.
follow-up email as well.
Yeah, I should have pulled that. Some of this, it's funny, I still work on the World War II material in between other projects, and I'll put some of that together, because I know there were some other companies on the list. And, you know, at first I thought, oh, that's just folklore. And then there are a couple sites that actually showed some things. So I'll be happy to pull that, and I'll get that to you. Any other questions or any other World War II memories that any of you would like to share? Or family memories? Carnegie, Illinois, that had to do, it wasn't that the plant was specifically called Carnegie, Illinois. It was that Carnegie, Illinois was a company that was created by the merger of a couple of different plants. And so Carnegie, Illinois comes from the merger of different companies that became Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company. They had plants. There were multiple plants in the Pittsburgh area. There was a Carnegie, Illinois steel plant in Gary, Indiana. It's just as if it was Westinghouse, who had plants in different parts of the country, or Alcoa. It had to do with the original facilities that were merged together. Oh, that story is so debated. I have to admit, I am not the expert on it. The story of the military plane, I believe that actually happened right at the end or after the war. And I would say there's a blog on our site that is still one of the most popular blogs on the site that relates to the story of that bomber that supposedly crashed in the Mon. In fact, there's a group in Pittsburgh that is still looking for it. There are a couple theories, and I'm going to add a massive disclaimer here. As I said, it's not an area that I have done as much work on as some others at the History Center. There are some people who feel that it really was something that crashed and it was retrieved. Then there's this idea that there were troughs in the river, that part of it was retrieved and then part of it kind of washed away. I know there's some people now who shake their head at the whole story. What I can do is, when I send some other information about the German spies, the target list, I'll also include the link to that blog post, because it remains one of the most, that and the 1936 flood are probably the two topics on which we get more questions than any other particular subject at the History Center, and especially the one with the plane. It's one of those weird mysteries that you would have thought that a piece that size going into the river, but there's also a theory that while we look at that river and think, oh, it would be so obvious, that that between the dirt and the current and other things, it's not impossible that whatever would have been there would have been gone and other pieces would have been retrieved. But I am not as up on that story as others at the History Center might be, I must admit.
How did that rumor get started?
That there's something seems to have truly happened, that something went in, and I have to admit that I don't know enough about it to be able to actually answer the story of how the rumor got started. But my understanding is that it seems like something actually happened, whether it was a plane or some other kind of experimental piece. You know, I mean, during the war, there are companies in this region. Westinghouse had a plant up near Pymatuning that was experimenting with electric torpedoes in the lake. There were other things that were going on. So it is possible that it literally was something, and maybe it was a bomber, but maybe it was something else that people were experimenting with. And that just got blown up into other kinds of stories. Oh, wow. I have ridden around Horseshoe Curve too. Before I did some research on this, so I think of that every time now. Yep, electric torpedoes. Actually, the scary thing is that we have a member of one of the committees who works with us, and I think he's now part of PHMC board too, who at one point had offered to try and get us one of those electric torpedoes for the exhibit. And I was a little hesitant about that because they're unless you can ensure that they have been diffused the right way, it's like, well, where are you going to get that? But I have not seen one in person. I would love to do so. There are some great photos. So any other comments? Yeah, thank you so much. I know that you have a lot of different activities that you can do, and I appreciate you participating in the library's program and attending this online program tonight. And I'll put a couple other resources together, and I'll be happy to send that sheet to the library.
All right, well, thank you so much. And if anyone thinks of any other questions or comments, feedback they want to send along, you can also always send that to me and I can pass it along. But yeah, I'll get out an email following up with everyone sometime tomorrow, hopefully with the link to the presentation tonight. So if you'd like to watch it again, or it'll be to share with people who couldn't make it tonight, and we'll include that sheet of information in there.
That would be great. And I'll tell you, I mean, we continue to collect on some of these topics. And for example, with Allegheny Ludlam, well, that's the story that I showed you tonight is a great story. We don't have as much on World War II activities from Allegheny Ludlam in our collection as we do from a couple of the other steel plants in the area. So if, for example, someone comes across material like that, we're always interested to know about it. So if you see anything you think we might be interested in, we've been on lockdown 2 for a year. The building has been open, and we're now slowly getting people back into the building finally and kind of resuming, I don't want to say normal activities yet, but we're moving in that direction. So we will be back to collecting at some point here. We're always interested to hear about things. So thank you very much. And I'll be sure to put a set of links together to get that to you guys.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you all have a great night.
Good night.